In the world of children's literature, there exists a magical realm where curiosity blooms and wonder thrives, a realm crafted by a talented author whose stories captivate young hearts and minds. With a literary portfolio spanning picture books, novels, nonfiction, and chapter books, she is a beacon of creativity for young readers everywhere. From her award-winning tales like The Brilliant Fall of Gianna to her captivating nonfiction series such as History Smashers, her stories not only entertain, but also ignite the imagination and spark exploration. Today, we have the privilege of diving into the imaginative world of this celebrated author. Please help me welcome Kate Messner.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Christopher. It's so nice to be here with you.
Can you recall any specific childhood book that sparked your passion for storytelling and ultimately led you to become an author?
Definitely. I sort of had two favorite kinds of books when I was a kid. The first kind, and probably my favorite, were the Ramona books by Beverly Cleary. I absolutely loved Ramona, and I read all of those books over and over. But then the other books that I really loved were nonfiction. I especially loved reading nonfiction about natural disasters and dangerous animals. And so it's kind of interesting that those were my favorite kinds of stories as a reader. I had really diverse interests, and I'm like that as a writer now, too.
Transitioning from a career in TV news reporting to becoming a full-time writer is quite a shift. How has your background in journalism influenced your approach to storytelling, particularly in crafting narratives for young readers? And what lessons from your reporting days do you find most valuable in your writing journey?
It's interesting. Back at when I was just out of college and working at NBC affiliates in Syracuse, New York, and Burlington, Vermont, I didn't plan to be writing children's books one day. It wasn't on my radar yet, but it's fascinating that so many of the skills that I learned both in college when I was studying broadcast journalism at the Newhouse School of Communication in Syracuse, and in my career have been so useful to me as a children's author. The interviewing, the fact checking, and the ability to tell a story in a conversational voice, to tell something that's true in a way that fits our storytelling brains. So really all of those things, I think, paved the way for my writing of nonfiction in particular.
Your Ranger in Time series follows the adventures of a time-traveling search and a rescue dog. What inspired you to combine elements of history and adventure in this unique chapter book series? And how do you approach making historical events accessible and engaging for young readers?
So I actually live on Lake Champlain in northern New York, which is a super, super historic lake. All kinds of battles from the American Revolution and the French and Indian War, and even the War of 1812 took place there, including one Revolutionary War battle that happened around an island that I can see from my kitchen window. And I always sort of wondered what it would be like if I could time travel and go back to the day that battle happened. Now, make no mistake, I don't want to be in the battle. I would be terrible at that. But I just would love to get a glimpse of what that lake that I love looked like while all this history was happening. And so that inspired me to try to write a time travel story. And I'll be honest, Ranger in Time was not what I came up with first. I actually wrote a few drafts of books, time travel books where people time travel, and they never quite turned out right. So I literally woke up one morning and thought, what if I tried the time travel, but instead of having a person be the main character, what if it's a dog? And what if it's a search and rescue dog, one of those dogs who's been trained to track missing people by following their scent? And then he can time travel, so he can go anywhere in history where people could use his help. And that was really the inspiration for Ranger. Now, it's interesting that you ask about making the stories accessible to young readers, because writing historical fiction has some real challenges in that capacity, especially for a chapter book audience. Lots of the stories I'm writing about in this series, we started with the Oregon Trail. We have a book about gladiators in ancient Rome. Books about D-Day and the American Revolution, about Hurricane Katrina, and even September 11th. There are parts of all of those stories that we wouldn't want to just lay on young readers with all the gory detail. But there are also ways to be honest with kids about history, ways to tell those stories in an age-appropriate way. It's really interesting. One of the when I started doing author visits and talking about this particular series at author visits, the Oregon Trail book was out. And so I was visiting a group of kids to talk about, the Oregon Trail, and the next book was going to be Ancient Rome. And at the end of that visit, a little second grader raised his hand and I said, "Oh yeah, do you have a question?" He said, "I do. Would you please write a Ranger in Time book about September 11th? And my first thought when he asked that question was, oh gosh, no, I can't write a September 11th book for second and third and fourth graders. It's not history. That's too recent. That's too sad. But it's funny. The next time I was visiting a school to talk about the Ranger in Time books, another second grader raised her hand. And I said, "Yeah, what's your question?" And she said, "Do you think you could write a Ranger in Time book about September 11th? And this happened again and again and again until I finally caught on. And I realized that kids are curious about September 11th. To them, this happened before they were born. It's another event in history. It's something sad that happened in history before they were born, just like the way I feel about Pearl Harbor, for example. But with September 11th, the grown-ups in their life still get sad when we talk about it and think about it. And that leaves this whole group of kids curious about what happened and a little freaked out by it, right? When there's something in history that happened and none of the grown-ups want to talk about it, that makes it a little bit scary. And I think that's why kids kept asking for this book over and over. And of course, there are ways to tell that story, to tell the truth about what happened, in a way that is appropriate for young readers. So that's what I always try to do and how I approach the Ranger in Time books, in a way that shares the truth with young readers, but does it in an age-appropriate way and in a way that's respectful to those young readers.
Your participation in programs like One School, One Book underscores the significance of community engagement with literature. Given the current controversy surrounding banned books across the country, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, I approach the banned books discussion from a couple different perspectives. Obviously, I'm an author, but I also used to be a middle school teacher. I spent 15 years in middle school classrooms and had an incredibly diverse classroom library with so many great titles. And kids would come back to me after they left my 7th grade classroom. I'd have 8th graders coming back, even high school kids coming back saying, "Hey, Mrs. Messner, do you have a book for me?" And I kept a huge diversity of titles in that library. And I always told parents at the very beginning of the year that those books were for everybody, right? But not every book was for every reader. And I invited parents to check out books from the classroom library, to read alongside their 7th graders. And I also did a little bit of education, right? I taught parents what to do if their child brought home a book that they didn't think was appropriate for their kid at that time. And the way we handled that, the way I handled that as a parent, the way anybody I think should, is to say, "Oh, this book isn't just right for you right now. So let's take that book back and we'll put it back on the shelf so the reader who does need that book can find it, and we'll find something else that's just right for you." That was an invitation I invited all my parents to do. I'm always happy to help kids find something that's just right. If they choose something that's, not fitting with their maturity level right then, I'm more than happy to find them something else. And so having those conversations with families at the beginning of the year really did help head off book bans. And honestly, I think these are the conversations we need to be having as a nation right now, right? How do we respect people's right to read? There's no book that's going to be right for every reader. And readers have hugely different needs. Readers of the same age even have hugely different needs when it comes to stories. So what we need to do is respect, first of all, every parent's right to help their own kids choose books. But understanding that, while you may have every right to help your kids choose books, you don't have any right to make those decisions for anyone else's child other than your own. And I think the sooner we all come around to that and we insist on that, in fact, the sooner we're going to be past this current wave of book banning, because honestly, it's an assault on intellectual freedom. And it's an attack on kids and their right to read. And I'm always willing to fight for that.
Your high-interest nonfiction series, History Smashers, offers young readers an opportunity to explore historical topics with a fresh perspective. How do you select which historical events or figures to feature in the series? And what do you hope readers take away from the informative yet entertaining books?
So the History Smashers series actually came about while I was working on the Ranger in Time books, while I was researching, there are 12 books in the Ranger in Time series about all different historical topics. And when I was researching those books, I noticed that some of what I was taught about history when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s wasn't quite true. In fact, a lot of the stories in my history books were more myth than what really happened. And then some things that did really happen got left out of my history books entirely. And that was really what made me want to write the History Smashers series. So History Smashers is a series of books. They are graphic nonfiction, which means they are 100% true. And they're told with lots of photographs and illustrations, and parts of the story are told in comics too. These are aimed at smashing the myths that we sometimes learn about history when we're very young. From, the myth of the first Thanksgiving to stories about George Washington. There never was a cherry tree. That was a completely invented story. And I think it's really important for us to question those myths that we're sometimes taught about history when we're very young, because those myths aren't just taught for fun, right? There's a reason that certain stories, particularly in American history, don't get shared and other stories do. And there's also a reason for stories like, that about America's founding that are more myth than actual history. So I think we need to really be interrogating those myths. And this series really aims to teach kids to think critically about history and to, when they read something, think, okay, where's the evidence that this actually happened? If we look at the Pilgrim's Diaries even, does it say that they invited the Wampanoag people over for Thanksgiving dinner? Spoiler, it doesn't. It's nowhere to be found, even though the Pilgrims wrote about pretty much everything else. And so I think it's really important to look at those primary sources and, in fact, to interrogate those primary sources too, right? And to consider that colonizers like the Pilgrims, like the Puritans, were writing their point of view and their point of view only, and maybe sometimes had incentives to say things that weren't true. So I love the critical thinking that this series inspires. We choose the topics in a few ways. We look at, first of all, topics that tend to be covered in elementary school and middle school classrooms. We also look at topics where there have been myths swirling around, right? Like the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, like George Washington and the American Revolution. There are myths about the Titanic. There are stories about Pearl Harbor, myths about plagues and pandemics in history, about Christopher Columbus and the Taino people, the people who lived in that part of the Caribbean for thousands of years before Columbus was even born. So those are some of the stories that we've smashed so far, and we've got quite a list of topics to smash in the future too.
In our conversation today, Kate Messner has illuminated not only the creative process behind her diverse body of work, but also the incredible impact that literature can have on young minds. From her childhood inspirations to her perspective on banned books and community engagement, Messner's insights offer wisdom for both aspiring authors and passionate readers alike. It has been my pleasure to delve into the world of storytelling with Kate Messner.
The pleasure was all mine, Christopher. Thanks so much for the invitation to chat with you today.